It is Tuesday, August the 4th, and welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns in this time of pandemic. I am Bill Whalen, a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution and the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Fellow in Journalism. It's my great honor today to moderate a conversation. Now, those of you who've been watching GoodFellows, you know our format, but for those of you first-time viewers, I'm going to clue you in as what you're about to see. This is a conversation featuring 2, 3, sometimes 4 Hoover Fellows, Hoover Senior Fellows. We like to call them the GoodFellows, with all due respect to Mr. Scorsese. These are our Hoover Fellows offering their unique insights into what may lie ahead in these complicated times. Now let's meet the GoodFellows, beginning with John Cochrane. He's an economist in the Hoover Institution's Rosemary and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow. John's also the author of the Grumpy Economist blog and the voice behind the Grumpy Economist podcast, which are a must-read and must-listen in these complicated times. Few people explain things as well as my friend John Cochrane. John, how is it? How goes things today?
Doing great, thank you.
Okay, we must comment on the shirt. I understand there's a little disagreement in the household of Cochrane over this shirt.
There was a little sartorial misunderstanding, yes, but now this is as stylish as we're going to get today.
It's kind of a French maritime look to it, if I might say, but it looks
good.
Of it
as Don Delir, but anyway, go ahead.
Looks good on you, John. Our second good fellow is Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, the Hoover Institution's Fouad Michel Al-Jami Senior Fellow. General McMaster served his country with honor and distinction for the better part of 35 years, his last tour of duty being that of National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. H.R., we missed you last week.
I missed you too, Bill. Good to see everybody.
I was going to ask you, on your honor as an officer and a gentleman, did you really miss not being on the show last week? Because you had work to do, didn't you?
I had a little bit of work to do, but I did miss you guys.
Okay, well, good to have you back, HR. Now, ordinarily, our third good fellow is the redoubtable Niall Ferguson, a historian and author, as well as the Hoover Institution's Milbank Family Senior Fellow. It's Neil's turn to take a week off this week, so he's somewhere out in the wilderness, chopping wood, wrestling bears, or I think actually more to the point, finishing a book that he's crashing on right now. So filling in for Neil this week in his considerable shoes is our friend Yuval Levin. Yuval Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He is also the author of A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. That book was published in January, so you can get it as soon as this show ends. Yuval, welcome to GoodFellows.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be with you.
Okay, I've got to ask you, you're in Washington, D.C., or just outside of the district. You had a windstorm. Did the windstorm come and take away the government like the Wizard of Oz and deliver us to a better time?
It seems to still be here, so I think the work is yet before us.
All right, so the federal government's still with us for now. Okay, so Yuval, I'd like you to begin this conversation. We want to talk today about institutional confidence or the lack thereof in America. I'd like to begin with an op-ed that you wrote for the New York Times, the date January 18th, 2020. So this is 2 months before society goes into lockdown, almost 7 months from this conversation. The headline of that, Yuval, was, "Did Americans Lose Faith in Everything?" I'd like to read you a passage, then I'd like to get your comments on how it would apply to today. Here's what you wrote in January for the New York Times, quote, "If American life is a big open space, it is not a space filled with individuals. It is a space filled with structures of social life, with institutions. And if we are too often failing to foster belonging, legitimacy, and trust, what we are confronting is a failure of institutions." You added, quote, "The social crisis is followed upon a collapse in institutions, public, private, civic, and political, but we have not given enough thought to just what that loss of confidence entails and why it's happening." Yuval, you wrote that again 2 months before society went into lockdown. If you had to write that again for the New York Times now, what would you say about institutions? The same as in January, in any way better, or in any way worse?
Well, thank you. That op-ed was a kind of summary of the case of the book you mentioned, A Time to Build, which tries to think about the reasons for the very widespread loss of confidence in institutions in America. And one of the conclusions it comes to is that we've been losing faith in institutions in part because a lot of people within many of our core institutions have come to think of them as not so much molds that ought to shape their character and behavior, but as platforms for them to perform on, as stages to stand on and be seen in the theater of our culture war. And I do think, unfortunately, that we have seen that pattern continue in the course of the country's response to this pandemic, where rather than be able to step back from our culture war debates and the intense political combat we'd been engaged in before, we've used this period of emergency in many ways to intensify and elevate those debates. You've seen some professions, including the public health profession, politicize themselves and use the platforms they have to advance culture war messages or political ideas rather than to show the country what professionalism looks like in an emergency. I think we've seen something like that in the press as well. I think we've continued to see it in our politics, where a lot of politicians, rather than allow their institutional obligations and responsibilities to form them, have instead used those institutions as platforms to stand on and channel frustration and build their own brand and build their own following. Now, look, some of our institutions have done better than I would have imagined. I think we should be grateful for American federalism after the last few months, and that on the whole, it has held up better than I would have thought. In some ways, even Congress has stepped up to pass some major relief legislation in a bipartisan way that happened quickly, and that I think has been fairly effective on the whole. It could have been better, but it could have been worse. And I think it would have been easy to imagine Congress failing to take that kind of action. But I think that in many cases, both in politics and around it, we've seen our institutions have real trouble rising to this challenge. And we've seen that the loss of public trust in institutions has real costs in moments of crisis. And we're seeing that cost exacted now.
Okay, John Cochrane, I know this is a hobby horse of yours.
Well, we're going to have a fun time. I mean, the loss of trust is in many ways well-deserved. I would have been even more depressed. I think what we've seen is the mid and lower levels of our bureaucracy showing off their stunning incompetence. Being able to handle a pandemic, a flu-like pandemic, should not be rocket science, and they just failed from beginning to end at sort of standard public health, identifying it, testing, tracing. The FDA, the CDC have been forbidding us to do basic, to use tests that can be used in other countries. We don't have a even reporting system in place. We can't use the tests we have. We still can't get N95 masks in this country. This isn't about, I mean, everybody loves to blame the president because everything in the United States has gotten focused on presidential politics, but this is just the competence of low-level bureaucracies. And of course, in the last couple of months, people have looked again at our police system and seen that as an institution in great need of reform. Police unions, like teachers' unions, seem to be not helping the matter. And perhaps there's hope in this, that Americans are now seeing a new kind of complete incompetence in sort of basic institutions you trusted to be competent once upon a time, and perhaps we'll put some attention into reforming them. I would close with just, I guess it's nice that our Congress has been able to do one thing: shower $5 trillion of newly printed money, right, left, and center, needed or not needed, write checks to every single voter in the country. But compared to, just the ability to collect data and disseminate it on where this crisis is bad and where it isn't, we're the country that can shower $5 trillion on free cash on everybody, but we can't seem to provide masks. So we're making our own little cloth masks. We're back to 14th century ways of stopping a pandemic.
Okay, well, HR, we have beaten up on the easy target of government right now, but Gallup looks at confidence in institutions all across society. I want to read you a few numbers here, gentlemen. Gallup, for example, they measured confidence in religion. These are 1975 numbers I'm going to give you. Public 68% confidence in religion in the United States of America. In 1975, 2019, it fell to 36%. Big business, 34% confidence in 1975, 23% confidence in 2019. The banking system, John Cochrane, 60% confidence in 1979, 30% confidence in 2019. The medical system, 80% confidence in 1975, 36% in 2019. Public schools, 62% confidence in 1975, 29% in 2019. HR, there's an outlier called the United States military, and I want to get to that in a few minutes, but we just look at these numbers and there's just distrust across the board in America. So HR, what do you think is going on here?
Well, I'll tell you, in the military, I know we can't take it for granted. I mean, I think that what is useful for us to remember is that the confidence in the military as an institution wasn't high during the Vietnam War. That was a reflection of what was going on in our society. It was a reflection of the frustrations over racism and the racial divisions in our country, opposition to the Vietnam War, an extremely poorly run war, and the civil unrest in the 1960s, associated with the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. I mean, it was a difficult period for the country, and that was reflected in the Army, which at the time, as you know, was a draft-based Army. So what happened is what followed really this crisis within the military broadly, but my institution, the Army in particular, was a period of introspection. And Yuval, I'm really glad to see you here because your book is tremendous. And I think when I read your chapter, I think it was chapter 9, where you talk about the importance of building a meritocratic institutions. I think this would get at some of John's concerns about incompetency. Really war is the great auditor of military institutions. I think we're going through a bit of an audit ourselves now with these crises associated with the pandemic, with the recession associated with the pandemic, with the murder of George Floyd and the aftermath of that murder that exposed the racial divisions in our society. And I think it might be analogous, Yuval, to what the U.S. Army did after Vietnam, with a period of introspection. There's an old study that was done at the Army War College in the 70s, a study on military professionalism within the Army, and a cadre of Army leaders who had seen the Army evolve from World War II through Vietnam. They led an effort to reform. And it was, as you mentioned in your book, a period of introspection that allowed them to lay a course for a real renaissance in the Army. And this was a renaissance in the areas of recruiting and recruiting standards, in leader development and education, an emphasis on moral and ethical leadership, and an emphasis really on building cohesive teams in our Army. And this is a theme in your book as well, is the need for us to connect with each other. I'm concerned that we have uphill battle, right? We've talked a lot on this show about the role of social media in pulling us apart, how this interaction that Yuval, you talk about in your book between racism and identity politics is polarizing us. So I'm glad you're here, because I do think that we can, given what John has said, really talk, I hope, about what your vision is for the reform of our institutions and the restoration of confidence and trust in them.
I appreciate that very much, Richard. Thank you. It really means a lot. One of the things that really stands out about the U.S. military over the last 40 years now is its emphasis on being seen and, in fact, on being a formative institution. When the Army worked to change its public perception, it didn't just say we're good at winning wars. It said we're good at forming men and women who will be better Americans. Be all that you can be. The Marines say the few, the proud. None of them are really talking about exactly doing their jobs. We believe the military is good at doing its job, but we also believe the military is good at forming human beings in a certain way. When somebody tells you that they went to Stanford, you might think, well, that's a smart person. He got into Stanford. When somebody tells you they went to West Point, you'd think that's a serious person, not because they got in, but because the military made them that way. We just have that impression of the military. I hope it's true too, but in any case, we have that impression. And that has an enormous amount to do with why public trust has increased in the military, even as it has fallen in just about every other institution, where we have much less of a sense that many of our other core institutions are really in the business of forming people, of shaping them in some way into a professional or into a trustworthy individual. And that kind of, the ethic that's required to be perceived that way, the ethic that's required to really be that way, is some of what needs our attention and investment now. And it's got and as John says, we've lost trust in our institutions because they've become less trustworthy. I mean, it's not that complicated. And ultimately, they have to prove themselves.
The contrast here between universities and the military, as far as forming individuals. Universities seem to be in the business of whatever political prejudices you come in at age 17, we want you to activate for them as you go on. I want to go back to one of your first comments, Yuval, about what's the fundamental problem going on, part of it is, I think, just the ossification of ever-expanding bureaucracy within many institutions. The sort of thing that happens to militaries who don't fight wars on occasion. They get bound up with the rule book. But you mentioned the cultural. As I look at it, I see, I'm of course an economist, but I see more of the political element. The story that I weave is more that our politics have become more winner take all. So the vital importance of winning the next election means you can shove it down their throats. The vital importance of getting control of the Supreme Court means you can shove it down your throats, and that necessitates politicization of all the institutions. As just one example, in today's news, Association of Teachers Unions demanded as a condition of going back to work, not just that it be COVID safe, but that reparations, universal basic income, canceling rent and mortgage be put into place. All of the institutions of civil society seem to have been bent to this political war. Now, it's a joint cultural political war. It's almost like the wars of the Reformation. There's a cultural element, but the cultural element strikes me as subservient to the political one. And we may as we look back 500 years and say, my God, they were butchering each other over the interpretation of what is the host at communion. Perhaps they'll go, but there was also who's going to get the money. So it strikes me a lot of what's going on is simply a cultural, religious, almost political, a reflection of a political imperative that every institution of society is now bent to that political case. And part of it is, and then I'll close, I promise. There's this, I forgot who mentioned this change in America from de Tocqueville's era, when if something was wrong, you create an institution. You put together a little board of your town and you fix the road. And now we are more devoted to getting management on our side. If people aren't treating each other right, rather than sort of a moral, let's promote people less based on race. No, we run to the Supreme Court to shove a national injunction down everybody else's throat. We're not in the business of creating institutions anymore. We're in the business of taking this extremely powerful federal government, grabbing it and shoving it down other people's throats. To what extent you can go back and defend the cultural if you want, but that seems to me like at least there's an incentive to do this that won't just be cured by, hey, people, why don't you calm down?
I think part of what happens there, because I very much agree with that way of describing the scene. And I think part of what we're seeing is the flattening of the terrain of our institutional life, so that all of our institutions come to serve the same purpose. They're all just stages to stand on and yell about oppression. Maybe this is a newspaper, maybe that's a university, but they're basically the same thing. They're just a place to stand and prove you're on the right team. And as all different kinds of institutions come to serve that same purpose, they fail to serve their different purposes. They fail to fill the particular spaces and niches that they have in our society. And it all becomes this one big culture war. And I do think that part of the reason for that is the polarization of our actual political sphere, where people think about the purpose of politics as making the other side go away, rather than as winning something in a process of bargaining and compromise. If you think that if you just pull through and win that election, then these guys will go away, then you'll do whatever it takes to get there. If you think they're always going to be there, and the question is, what can we achieve given that we live with different people in a diverse society, you're just going to have a different attitude about what you're trying to do. And I think that's very much reflected in our attitude about institutional formation, where, as you say, Tocqueville has this joke that if you get 3 Americans together, they'll elect a treasurer. I think we're much less like that than we used to be. And there's a much greater inclination now to fold your arms and stand around and wait for somebody to show up and fix it for you. And, that too is a function of a kind of politicization of our expectations. We see everything in the same partisan terms. And that makes it very difficult to think that the problem that's in front of us, maybe it's just our problem. Maybe we have to get together and fix it and figure it out.
Well, I think the root is the increasing power of the federal government, especially the increasing power of the executive, the increasing power of the administrative agencies, the increasing power of the judiciary to decide fundamental issues, so that getting control of them in one election allows you to shove a whole lot more down the other side's throats. I don't think your characterization, nobody's folding up their arms and waiting for someone else to do it. The three Americans get together, launch a website and tweet about how evil everybody who disagrees with them is, and they're racists, or whatever the other side says, or they're anti-American and anti-patriotic, demonize them, try to get a 51% of the next election, and then try to use those handles of power to shove their agenda down the other side.
Right. Well, gentlemen, let me read you some more Gallup numbers here and get your thoughts on this. So Gallup also looked at institutions of government, and they looked at three groups. They looked at the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the presidency. They looked at the triangles of government. So the Supreme Court numbers: 45% confidence in 1973, 38% confidence in 2019. So less, but not hugely less. The presidency: 52% confidence in 1975. This would be Gerald Ford post-Watergate. 38% in 2019. Maybe not what you would have expected, but now let's look at Congress. 40% confidence in 1975. If any of you want to hazard a guess, you're probably going to aim too high. 11% in 2019. Now, Will Rogers made a very good living making fun of Congress. It was a joke, though, but 11% confidence would speak to genuine animosity toward Congress. So, Yuval, what did Congress do to earn 11% confidence?
I think there are a couple of things to say about those numbers. One is that the United States, in the middle of the 20th century, coming out of the Second World War and the Depression and a period of intense mobilization, I would argue, for all that I care about institutions and love them, that we had too much confidence in institutions in the middle of the 20th century. That in some important ways, those earlier numbers, and especially if you look at those numbers, we don't have those Gallup numbers that are comparable, but if you look at confidence in institutions in the late 1950s, you had numbers in the 70 and 80% range. And I think that's kind of crazy in a democratic society. And there needed to be some process of liberalization where we regain some sense of skepticism, which I think is healthy. We've obviously gone too far. And I think Congress has actually earned that mistrust. A lot of the problems that confront our system now, including the excessive power of the courts, including the overreach of the administrative state, seem to me like the result of a willful dereliction of the US Congress, an intentional chosen weakness on the part of the Congress, which has created a vacuum that has been filled in by judges and sometimes by presidents and often by bureaucrats. And that space needs to be filled by Congress. And Congress is distinctly in our system an institution that is meant to channel disagreement in an ongoing way. Our Congress is not a European Parliament where you have a majority for a time, it gets to do everything it wants until the public throws it out. Our Congress is designed to channel disagreement in an ongoing way, to compel accommodation and compromise. And the Congress has not worked that way in the last several decades. For a variety of reasons, the budget process and the committee system and various reforms of how the institution works have all worked to shield members from taking responsibility for hard decisions, and therefore to weaken the Congress and to pass a law. You'll pass laws that say the secretary shall X, Y, and Z, and then it's the executive's problem, and the judges will come in and clean it up when it gets messy. And so I think I worry about the loss of confidence in a lot of our institutions, but loss of confidence in Congress, it has happened for good reason, and Congress needs to reassert itself and can. It has the constitutional authority to do that. What's lacking is the will, and I think it is still lacking.
And you're right. Where your grandstanding claim, I think, is most forceful is the individual member of Congress.
Yeah.
To say, I negotiated a hard bill, we gave up some stuff, we got some stuff, we got to a compromise on, let's say, immigration. Let's take something that has been broken for decades in the US, or the tax system. That doesn't get you reelected. You have to go be a pure warrior on Fox News or a pure warrior on CNN if you want to get reelected. But if that is the institution where you're supposed to make the hard compromises, construct the durable thing that binds us together because everyone got represented, as opposed to some sweeping Supreme Court decision that just wipes the other half out.
Mm-hmm.
You make this distinction between institutions that are performative rather than formative, right? It seems that rather than trying to accomplish things, many leaders of these so-called leaders of these institutions now, they just want to be heard. They want their voice heard. They want to perform for an audience. I mean, how do you see that transition happening in Congress? Do you think it might be possible to highlight those members of Congress who actually are there for formative purposes, who are doing good work? Because I know many of these younger members now, who, especially the veterans who have come into Congress, they make a pledge to really to try to work in a bipartisan way to try to solve problems and make progress. Can you give us a glimmer of hope for reform within the legislative branch?
Yeah, I think Congress really is a place where that transformation from formative to performative is very powerfully evident, where a lot of the incentives for members are basically to pretend to be outsiders while they're insiders, to stand aside and say, you wouldn't believe what happens in Congress, and, you know, sort of sharing the frustration of the TV viewer. And that viewer might stop to think and say, well, I don't know, you are Congress. What is happening in Congress? I think the incentives in that direction are extremely powerful now. Some of those are a matter of the kind of electoral logic where members just don't want to take risks, don't want to take hard votes. And all they want to do is show their voters that they share the same frustration those voters have. I do think, though, that there are some institutional reforms that could help change some of those incentives. I think incentives are everything in this respect. I mean, politicians are not less ambitious than they used to be. Madison wasn't wrong about their psychology, but it does seem like Congress doesn't want power, as Madison expected that it would always want power. And I think part of the reason for that is now their ambition is channeled in a much more performative way. And what they want is prominence more than what we would think of traditionally as political power. So that changes to the way the budget process is structured, changes to the committee system, some decentralization in Congress that would give individual members something to do and something to show their constituents that they have done for them, would make it much easier for members who are actually interested in the legislative work to do that work seriously and to get credit for it. At the moment, if you're not the majority leader of the Senate or the Speaker of the House, there's just not much for you to do in Congress. And it's not that surprising that you spend your time looking for the cameras, and that, you know, if you go to a congressional hearing now, it's just a bunch of people producing YouTube clips to use later. There's no conversation, there's no negotiation, there's no legislation. And I do think some of that is a function of a kind of consolidation of power in the leadership that can be reversed and should be reversed. And, you know, Congress goes through these periods of internal institutional reform every generation or so, and it's time. It's been too long.
I'd like to move you a little bit just in that, because we tend to talk about government a lot, but I'd like to get your views on the institutions of civil society. I mean, I think too many people view democracy as a matter of voting. And in fact, we depend so much on these institutions we're talking about, the judiciary, the police, and so forth, the institutions of government, the bureaucratic institutions, but also the almost Tocquevillian institutions of civil society, nonprofits, non-governmental organizations, even the slightly governments like the Federal Reserve. As a sort of conservative libertarian, I'm of course especially sensitive that they all seem to be taken over by the progressive left. The universities, of course, are nothing but, and it's not just virtue signaling, it's signaling that we're on a political team that is determined, it's considered evil to be Republican, is every bit as part of it as your good feelings about the appropriate victims of the day. But as I think of it, that it used to be that the ACLU, the Audubon Society, Planned Parenthood actually cared about the things they cared about, as opposed to being just foaming at the mouth about Trump all the time. But all of those, try to be on a board of an art museum and be a Republican right now. Certainly, I watch central banks, and central banks are moving headlong into inequality and climate change, or at least were till they took a temporary tour into printing up money for COVID, but they'll be back to that. These are important, and I think most people forget how important the institutions from the local school boards. have become foaming at the mouth about Trump and not about how are we going to get our kids properly educated to educate.
But John, they have their own problems. For example, I got an email from the Sierra Club the other day giving a long explanation about John Muir. I was in Pasadena over the weekend. John Muir High School. There is a fight to kick John Muir off the name of the high school. So these institutions, even something as good as an environmental institution, they're under attack for various ways. Now it's political correctness, mind you, but still it's an erosive problem that's going on with them as well. So the question, gentlemen, is besides the military, is anything else in America as far as an institution, is anything really above the fray right now, or is it fair game across the board?
I do think that this kind of politicization, where a lot of civil society views itself as existing in a sense to interface with government or with politics, rather than seeing itself as in possession of some domain of American life where this is our responsibility and we should think about this rather than how this relates to politics. It's hard to even convey that now to people who run small local institutions. And like you say, I mean, the school board in my county in Maryland had a big controversy last year about about what attitude it should have about family separation at the border. Well, okay, but we're not at the border, and you have schools to run, and you can do this later. I think that sense just is now very hard to convey to people, that it's not all one big war, but that we have some distinct and individual things to do here that we might be able to do as local institutions, as small-scale civil society institutions.
And to do those, it might be nice if you allowed people to be overtly Republican or libertarian and serve on this board. I mean, you can't be out of that closet in Palo Alto if you want to serve on in any public forum.
What I detect though, Yuval and John and Bill, is an untapped desire to serve among our young people, right? And they are, I think they're obviously subjected to social media, all of these forces that we've mentioned, and Yuval, you cover in your book, that kind of pull us apart from each other. But there was recently this National Commission on Public Service that I think had some really good findings. There are organizations and recommendations. There are organizations out there that really don't care what your political leanings are. I mean, I'm thinking of a veterans organization named Team Rubicon, and what they are, they're veterans who volunteer in time of crises to go to wherever the floods are happening, or to help in ways that allow them to continue to serve in ways that different from what they served in the military. There's an organization called U.S. Civilian Corps now that is trying to figure out how to match the desire to serve with the need to serve, and has actually activated a lot of people who are willing to go to the most hard-hit COVID areas, in public hospitals that were under-resourced, or to work in nursing homes. These are nurses and respiratory therapists, and matching those willing to move and to do that tough work under tough conditions to the need. So I think it's out there, and I just wish we could use the power of our information technology to make some of those connections, rather than to be subject to algorithms that pull us apart from each other.
Do young people want to serve in a small way to help a community, to help those in need, or do they want to do jihad? Or do they want to basically go out and smite the heathen and advance our side of the great religious war? I mean, the young people who are out there serving by burning down minority neighborhoods in the name of social justice, they don't seem to want to.
Well, I mean, obviously,
there's an impulse in humanity to serve, to help your community, which is what you're pointing out, and it's one of the best things in people. There's also the religious impulse to go out and convert, to your point of view, and to get off the face of the earth people who feel differently. And I see a lot of that in young people these days.
But I think that there is, I think there's a desire for something more constructive, and that we have, the demand is there and the supply is not. That a lot of what these younger people confront when they look to do something worthwhile are options that all look like burning down the other side. And it does seem to me that argues for some ethic of institution building. You know, you can look at late 19th, early 20th century America, where a country that faced some similar problems to ours, urbanization and mass immigration and a certain kind of growth of government, but also just new sorts of challenges. And eventually, not right away, it went through a very dark political period, but eventually there was a period of real institution building, new universities, new kinds of social and youth movements. I think we are not right now in the mode of institution building. We're not thinking that maybe the solution to the absences we feel is building something in this space that isn't there now. Maybe all of those friends of ours on the right who complain about universities should start a university and see what might be involved in making it a worthwhile alternative. That's really what that's how a lot of the 19th century universities, my university, the University of Chicago, but also Stanford and Duke and Johns Hopkins in different ways, all came to be in those times, in those moments when there was enormous dissatisfaction with what the old established Ivy League schools were doing, but that was channeled into a constructive moment of institution building. I think that the frustration is there now, but we've not yet seen that moment. And it's why I think that this is coming to be really a time to build. I mean, I think it calls for us to think about what we can start, not only what we can burn down. And that's still yet to begin, it seems to me.
You mentioned frustration, so this is a good segue to mention what's ahead 13 weeks from today, and that is the presidential election. We have a choice right now. We have a president of the United States who is doing his best to convince the public that you should not trust in any way the public vote, that it's going to be ridden with fraud. You can't trust the post office. Well, it's not a very hard push, I guess, not to trust the post office, but just whatever the results are, you can't trust them. The president's opponents would have you believe that the president does not believe in the institution of democracy. If he doesn't want to cancel the election outright or delay it, he's going to have to be dragged physically out of office. So, gentlemen, how are we going to have an election that does not further erode, if not seriously cripple, institutional confidence in democracy?
Can I start? Because I'm very worried about this election. And it's not just Trump, it's on both sides. We have the most important thing about democracies can be incompetent at everything else, but a peaceful transfer of power is the most important thing. And that's what the problem with monarchy was, is you fight a war every 30 years. It's the one that you can lose an election and regroup and be there 4 years from now and not lose your property, your life, your business. Most of the world, you lose an election, you're gone. So the ability to even when it's dicey, to agree somebody's won, they're legitimate, they're in for 4 years. This has been going on a long time. I learned that Richard Nixon, when he lost in 1960, he arguably had that election stolen from him. But he said, no, I'm not going to demand a recount in Chicago because that would be bad for the country. Can you imagine anyone doing that now? And you put it on Trump, so I'm going back his history. The hanging chads from the Bush election, I think, there was a great part of the left that never acknowledged that George Bush actually did win that election. I read the New Yorker. They were after him for having stolen the election for at least 15 years, and they've never admitted he really won it. And of course, what we've seen now, along with the increasing criminalization of politics, we're doing our politics by investigation, by constant impeachment. The dangers of losing are going to be worse and worse. So with that preamble, I worry going into this. Suppose this is a close election, and on both sides, that means we start the recounts, but it's going to be full of mail-in ballots. And Trump will be saying chaos, whatever, and it's stolen. But the left will be saying, oh, you didn't let in ballots that were postmarked badly, that were 14 days old and that were counted 3 months later, and somebody had put a X in the wrong place. All of this winds up in the courts. And this could just be an unbelievable disaster, leading to the greatest disaster of all, half the country not accepting the legitimacy of what comes afterwards. That's John,
it ends up at the Supreme Court, which is 4-4 with one vacancy.
If it even ends up in the Supreme Court, there's going to be national injunctions by federal district courts here, there, and the other place. When it ends, there's going to be people out in the streets. it's just going to be total chaos, or it can be. The one thing I pray for is a decisive election, one way or the other. Let it be over the day afterwards, and we all admit one side, one or the other. That's the most important thing, and that's the thing I'm most worried about not happening.
So Yuval,
you've written about this, so I'm going on and on about your op-ed.
No, I very much share that worry, and I very much share that hope that this is a decisive election one way or another. I would only add that because this will be happening in the middle of a pandemic, there will be much more mail-in voting than we have seen before, and in a lot of states that are just not used to it at all. And we've seen in some primaries now in New York and in Maryland and in a few other states that mail-in voting can take a long time to count. It can be a complicated problem when you have to verify signatures and contact people. The way state laws work, which are designed for small numbers of mailed-in ballots from the military and others, now they're going to have to deal with millions of people. We may well not have results from a lot of states on election night, even if it's not that close. And what we ought to be doing in preparation for that is preparing the public to see that an election that takes more than a few hours to count is not therefore illegitimate. And of course, we're doing exactly the opposite of that. We're preparing the public to assume that the election is illegitimate if it doesn't work in the way that it normally would. I think there are ways to give the states some more time to count, and Congress can take steps in that direction. There are ways to prepare technologically, and in other ways, election administration. We know what incompetence looks like in a moment of crisis, and we need to be very, very sure that we've done everything we can to make sure that our election administration is not incompetent on election day. I have to tell you, at this point, that has not been done, and I'm very concerned about the election.
If I may, we know that November 7th, an army of lawyers is going to fan out around the country ready to second guess every signature and smudge. And we have before us the wonderful, the one thing we know the US is incapable of doing is building bureaucratic capacity swiftly. Look at the wonderful confidence at dealing with the COVID epidemic. You know, that TSA hasn't yet thought to measure people's temperatures the way the Chinese did about one day after this started. We don't have contact tracers. We don't have tests. We don't have N95 masks, back where I started with, building bureaucratic competence, then, people ready to count votes, trained in the right place and so forth ahead of time. That's what we need, obviously. And that's what I'm so despairing that is the one thing that we're really bad at doing right now. Somehow HR in the Second World War, though it was all foobar and snafu, nonetheless, we built things up pretty darn quickly with the emergency in hand.
Right. Well, I think that we have an opportunity here, though, to come out of this stronger. I mean, I think that, we're highlighting all the dangers in advance. We ought to all get to work on this, right? We ought to, make sure that we have as strong voice as we can on rejecting any kind of orthodoxies, not allowing others to define, who we are as a people by generation or by political party. I think we have to demand from our politicians, an ethos of service, right? Something larger than themselves. You alluded to this with Nixon saying, "Hey, it wouldn't be good for the country to contest the election," and we have to demand just better performance. As you mentioned, John, from the bureaucracy, I think better performance, Yuval, from our politicians, so that they are actually focused on less on performing. And more on getting things done on our behalf. So I think that what we need is more trust in who we are as a people and in our institutions. I was thinking, you guys have me thinking about how really we are doing to ourselves what the Russians really hoped to do to us in the 2016 election, right? I personally don't believe that the Russians, I don't think they thought Donald Trump could win. I don't think they cared who won. What they were doing is setting the conditions to pull us apart. It's common knowledge now that the Internet Research Agency, the bot and troll traffic associated with the Russian GRU, that traffic went way up after the election, right? Because in an effort to try to delegitimize the process. And so we have to recognize that if we create these weaknesses in our society, if we create a crisis of confidence, there are adversaries who are going to do their best to exploit it. And what they really want to do is they want to crush our confidence in our democratic principles, our institutions, and our processes.
We have a good
That's
test.
why, Yuval, your op-ed is so important. We have to highlight this, but then we have to do something about it. We have to talk to each other. We have to. It's tough in a pandemic, right? But we do have to. We have to come together in as many fora as we can, and reject the extremes, reject the orthodoxy, reject those who try to define who we are. So I hope that we can get it done, between now and November, and we should have as loud voice as we can on this.
Most of what we need by November is bureaucratic competence. I mean, that's the first line of defense before the machinery of the American political system has to go in. And just as one more example, in about 10 days, schools are supposed to open. And if you want to look at a case of completely unprepared for something we all have known was coming for 6 months, that I think about defines it.
So I began this broadcast by giving you a long list of institutions that have suffered over the past 4 decades or so. So why don't we wind down this conversation? Let me again list off some of these. I mentioned the presidency, Congress, the Supreme Court, the media, public schools, medical systems, banks, businesses, small and large, organized labor, public schools, religion. Gentlemen, if there's such a thing as a rebuild of institutions in this society, creating more confidence of all those institutions, where do you start?
Can I just, so Yuval has written about family, and I'd like to give him 30 seconds to add that to our list of institutions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that at some level, this has to start from the bottom up. And it does seem to me that we have to see that families are the core institutions of any society. And they are where we build our sense of responsibility, of obligation to other people, where we understand the limits of choice, even in a free society. And I do think that a recovery of our commitment to family is where this ought to begin. And at the other end of the spectrum, in thinking about the political system, I think reforms in Congress are essential prerequisites for any other improvements in the functioning of our federal government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the family, and especially as in the current environment, the rates of single parenthood are astronomical, especially among low-income minorities. It's not really a racial thing, as Charles Murray has shown us with Fishtown. In sort of low-income America, there's a woman, several children, men come and go. Children grow up in atrocious public schools, young men especially, never see a father figure, a man working. And then we expect at 18 somehow that this is all going to solve itself, or maybe, from the left, well, we'll just send them a check and then they'll straighten out. Well, there's a horrible idea. I'm of course, as an economist, partial to the idea that government policy has been a lot of the problem, but I don't see, I mean, that is just this screaming problem of what gets expressed as inequality. I think of it as lack of opportunity, but the way sort of lower income America is stuck.
HR?
Yeah, I really wanted to emphasize just civil society and how we can come together within our communities. I see this in the military. You have people, they come from all different backgrounds. They bring with them all different biases and maybe prejudices. But when they're together and they're working together on a common mission, they all that melts away, and they're bound together by that common purpose, bonds of trust and affection that grow over time. So I just think, for Americans, what can we do? We can get involved at the local level and take on a project. Take on something that is, in Yuval's terms, formative rather than performative, and get something done for our fellow Americans. So I think that there are plenty of opportunities to do that. It's tough in a pandemic to do it, but I do think that as Yuval said, we have to work on this from the bottom up, and restore our confidence, right, in who we are and what we mean to each other.
HR, I don't know what we'd do without you, because Yuval, you may not have noticed, HR is always he's the optimist, and he knows we can pull together and get this done. And otherwise
we can't do without it. That's for sure.
What a balanced tickets. That's interesting. So none of you chose the presidency, because I might have thought that you would have said that change begins at the top and filters down, but you're suggesting that change begins at the bottom and filters up.
I guess I just think Congress is the top. I'm a congressional supremacist, and I think the federal government can't work until Congress does. So even if we think about top down and not bottom up, I think the presidency is secondary.
And even reforming Congress, even reforming Congress is bottom up, right? Because Congress will respond to social pressure to change, right? And that's what we ought to demand.
I think the point of institutions is that everybody in this country is focused on the presidency. And if we just elect the one perfect God King to come in, he or she will go out and make everything right. And that's absolutely not how democracy works. So yeah, having wonderful, great, competent presidents would be a fine thing, but the machinery of democracy depends on the institutions at the bottom, and that's what everybody ignores.
Right. So Yuval, is it possible to affect change while you're in the middle of a pandemic and people are naturally on edge and people tend to be cynical of what the government is doing and people are just confused by sometimes conflicting advice coming out of their government? Is this a post-pandemic issue we're looking at?
Well, maybe, but I think there are ways to use a moment of crisis or emergency like this where it creates certain kinds of possibilities. It accelerates certain kinds of changes. We're doing a lot more now using various technologies that we might have been much slower to take up before. We can think in more creative ways about how our institutions might function. So certainly, I think a lot of this kind of thinking would need to wait until life is back to something more like normal. But we can learn lessons in this pandemic and we can try to change some of our ways of doing things precisely because there are these new pressures that force us to try new things.
America only reforms in times of crisis. It's a terrible thing to let go to waste, as Rahm Emanuel famously said.
Always bring it back to Chicago, don't you, John? So that is something we didn't bring up in this conversation. Is this a uniquely American problem right now, Yuval, or do you look around the globe and see other nations, other societies likewise going through institutional crises?
It's certainly not uniquely American. I think in some ways what's uniquely American is the capacity for institution building that is kind of in our DNA, so that it feels like more of a loss to us, because I think we are traditionally very good institution builders. But the kinds of forces that we see, including loss of confidence in institutions, the public opinion data on that in Europe is really staggering. Even in countries that we think of as having pretty competent governments in particular, I know less about the data on civil society, but Germans, for example, have very low levels of confidence in their government. And you find that basically the same trends over the same period of time around the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it goes beyond the West, right? And of course, I don't want to compare us to Lebanon, but when you look at Lebanon, you can't help but feel fortunate. I mean, that's a state that is really undergoing an utter collapse. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy for the security in the region that is already strained by, the serial mass murders of the Syrian civil war and violence associated with the rise of ISIS and the defeat of ISIS. So I think the situation is quite dire, across the greater Middle East right now. And there have been, of course, these series of protests across the region, from Tehran to Baghdad to Lebanon, to voice people's dissatisfaction with their governments. I think we should feel fortunate that we have institutions to reform, that we do live in a democracy in which we can demand change from our government through the power of our ability to vote, and then, of course, the voice that we have in our free and open society. And I think that it's time for us to recognize that we're in a crisis, that there's a need to reform, but also to be encouraged, at least, that we're in a system that was created in a way that we can change and we can improve.
So, as I look around, it is, especially in economic policy, which is what I follow more, smaller countries have been able to do sensible reforms that we have not been able to do. So as I look, the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, and New Zealand as well, smaller countries somehow still, the elites have not gotten quite so far distanced from actual people, and they're able to do things like fix their social security system, fix their tax codes, fix the horrendous disincentives of their social program. Sweden used to be socialist, and it said, everybody's hanging around taking a check, nobody's working. We're going to put in some carrots and some sticks and make this system work. And they were able to do it. Things that are just sitting as open wounds on the American political and policy landscape for years.
I think one way in which there is a distinctly American sclerosis has to do with a kind of generational pattern in our politics, where our leaders really are unusually old in the United States at the moment. it's a very odd situation where we've got a 74-year-old president being challenged by a 78-year-old challenger in the next election. The Speaker of the House is 80. The Majority Leader of the Senate is 78. That actually is very strange, and it's not the pattern around the West. It's not the pattern around the world. I do think it has something to do with our failure to think about the future. And in that sense, at least, there may be some promise in generational change on all sides of our politics over time.
Sure, I'm going to give you the final thoughts as we run out of time. So the idea of a V-shaped recovery for the economy, what shaped recovery do you see for institutional confidence? Do you think, you think it's quick? Is it generational? Should we be looking for a couple years? Or is this something that we should be considering for maybe years and decades?
I think for years and decades, right? And I'm just, again, it's an imperfect metaphor to look at the Renaissance in the Army and the post-Vietnam period, but it took a period of introspection, and then it took a period of really building momentum behind the reform movement, and bringing people in to the effort, getting buy-in across the organization and the institution. So I think it's going to take time, but I think if we can involve all the American people in this, recognize, hey, the first step is we have a real crisis here that we have to work on together. I think, in the military, it's that sense of mission that brings people together. And hey, we have a couple of missions in front of us, right? We have a mission to get through a pandemic, to recover economically from it, and to reform our institutions and restore our faith in our government. So, hey, that's plenty of work to do, right? That's job security for all of us in a democracy, and we should all just get to work on it.
John, I'll give you the last word, then we got to go.
Okay. I just want to say, I think we're at a deep inflection point with our institutions. The Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Ancien Regime, all these are societies that let their institutions slowly rot and get hidebound, and then were unable to deal with a big crisis. The three of us seem committed to this low-level, fix the institutions of democracy, not just fight the next religious war. That isn't breaking out all around us, and the sort of end of empire feeling is I think the big danger, and that's a decades one, but that's the one to worry about.
Hey, gentlemen, we're going to call it a wrap. Yuval Levin, hey, thanks for joining us today. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Great topic. Stay safe in Washington. Please try to fix the nation's capital. I mentioned, by the way, Yuval's book, the title again, and then again, it came out in January. It's on Amazon waiting for you. The title is A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus. How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. It's there on Amazon. Go get it, folks. So that's it for this week's GoodFellows. On the behalf of the GoodFellows, John Cochrane, H. McMaster, our guest Yuval Levin, the missing Niall Ferguson somewhere in the forest primeval. We wish you all the best. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed. We'll see you next week.